Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
I am very excited to have the opportunity to interview Alex Baniczky, who is the SVP and head of BMO Capital Partners. And today we're going to be talking about the really important theme of how to support more Canadian companies to grow and succeed, which, especially in this context of the productivity crisis that so many folks are talking about in Canada and the recent changes to capital gains tax and various other things, is definitely something that's very top of mind to many folks in Canada. So Alex, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Scott, thanks for having me. I have to admit, podcasts are helping me get through this horrible driving situation in Toronto. So I'm very excited to be here. It's how I spend most of my mornings, and certainly is a big part of keeping me calm during our commutes.
Oh yeah. Hopefully you don't have too long of a commute then. Hopefully you're not one of the people with like an hour and a half.
No.
Good. Yeah, Toronto, we need to get a hold of that the traffic situation. I recently was reading that I think we're like the second worst city in North America for traffic, and it's not good.
No, definitely not.
So on the topic of how to help more Canadian companies grow and succeed, Canada has a lot of challenges, but we also have a lot of strengths. What do you think are the most significant kind of economic strengths or kind of assets that Canada has as a country?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, Canada does have a lot of strengths. I think sometimes we underplay the strengths that we do have. I became a little bit fascinated, I guess, with the situation that was unfolding down in the U.S. around affirmative action, particularly at the Ivy League schools. And this concept that affirmative action was actually leading to more inclusivity at the schools. I had mistakenly believed that this was providing opportunities for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds to go to Harvard or Yale, et cetera, et cetera. In practicality, I understand that was not the case. That all that they really did was displace somebody, a millionaire's son from California with a millionaire's son from Mexico. And one of the things that they kept harkening on was actually the Canadian university experience and how the broad-based acceptance level that we have here has led to a greater level of tertiary or post-secondary education. And when you look at the numbers, I mean, it's quite a staggering difference between post-secondary education in Canada versus the US, which is, obviously the comparator we use most frequently. And I think as we look forward to the changing Canadian economic landscape, the advantage that we have in education is going to be one that is going to be fundamental to us succeeding in the future, specifically with knowledge-based industries. And I think that's a big part of why our tech industry has been so successful over the last decade. It's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it is something that I'm fascinated by. And then the other thing that I'd be remiss not to point out, and I think is a huge success factor for Canada in general, is the increased participation of women in the workforce, which you can tie into a lot of the support mechanisms that have been put in place over the last decade. The fact that we have a 7 percentage point advantage vis-a-vis the US in female participation is huge. And it's backdropped by the fact that we support them with programs for maternity leave and, increasingly other programs that allow them to participate in the workforce. And when you think about 500,000 workers and the advantage that's going to create for the Canadian economy, it's staggering.
It's a huge economic strength Canada has relative to the US. I once, around 2 years ago, I went to an event in Toronto where it was Secretary Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, and Chrystia Freeland were speaking. And a lot of it was actually about childcare, like 80% of the conversation. And Secretary Yellen was just talking about that. I think it was, I forget the number, but it's basically that if the US had the same female labor force participation as Canada, there would be it was like 3-4 million more workers, like in the US economy. Like the scale of it is massive. And I lived in the US for 5 years and now have a lot of friends who are having kids. And a lot of the female in the couple once they have kids, like way more than I find in Canada, are dropping out of the workforce.
Yeah.
And that's just one thing in my own personal life, I've seen it sort of directly as well. And yeah, I think it's something a lot of the time people in Canada actually don't appreciate how different it is in the US and for a lot of parents.
And the payback is huge, right? I mean, I think that's the thing. Losing these people from the workforce would be terrible, but the economic payback for Canada, not only now for the long term, I think will continue to be tremendously beneficial. And it's something that probably we don't spend enough time recognizing or celebrating, quite frankly.
Absolutely. And if you think of the fact only like 50% of the workforce is being like truly like as equitably kind of incorporated like as versus like 50% where there's a much lower rate of workforce participation, that's a huge economic drain.
Huge.
And so many folks, the sad thing in the US is that there's a lot of women I know who want to work, who want to keep their careers, and just the sort of structural system doesn't really provide that genuine choice, and it's just so difficult to sort of raise kids and work in the US. I'd say it's definitely not impossible. I think of my first boss in the US. She had 2 kids under the age of 3 and was like a corporate executive. And now that comes with it some privilege of like the ability to pay for like a full-time nanny that lived with them. So not everybody can afford a live-in nanny. But yeah, I think it's a huge economic strength for Canada that we often don't appreciate. So shifting a little bit to the weaknesses, because strengths are important, but also it's important to think about ways that we can be better as a country. What are some of the ways that you think? What are some of the most significant things that hold us back economically as a country?
Yeah, we do have a strong history of being hewers of wood and miners of ore. And I sometimes feel that our resource background hampers us, quite frankly, when it comes to the changing economy, particularly the knowledge-based economy and what the future is going to hold. I think that the overhang from some of our resource-intensive industries is still there. We saw that post, I guess, 2013, 2014 in Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular, when oil was on a bit of a downswing, there was actually a tremendous uptick in knowledge-based industries and people entering into those industries. Because quite frankly, there's a tremendous workforce that exists in both of those economies, but they tend to be dragged into oil and gas companies. But having that not being an option, I think we, gave birth to a tremendous amount of knowledge-based companies that have been very, very successful. And my concern always is that we sort of revert back to the norm, and that once petroleum picks up or other resource industries pick up, that we sort of lose those people back to those industries that we have. And when I look forward to the future, I mean, and the transitioning that's going to happen not only in the Canadian economy but more globally as we move towards carbon zero and all those sort of things, knowledge-based companies like those are going to be critical to our success. And what we don't want to have happen, as we've seen in petrochemicals in the past, is where we're simply extracting the resources and then sending them elsewhere for processing. So when we think about the future and electrification and generation of electricity, it would be nice to see us develop more along the lines of not only having great strengths in our resources, but also making sure that they're developed and brought to full fruition within the Canadian context, if that makes sense.
In so many different contexts, particularly in developing economies, people talk about the resource curse.
Yeah,
which
it is a
is
curse.
it is a curse. It can bring a lot of. It's kind of like when you hear these stories of people winning the lottery. It can be great for the first couple of years, and then it ends up with you having no money. All your life has been ruined, and there's all this kind of complexity. That being said, there's some countries that can have successfully navigated it. Very few. Norway, I think, is like an example of perhaps what Canada should have done,
Yep.
where they have a 1.3 or 4 trillion dollar sovereign wealth fund, and they've been able to diversify their economy significantly into new things. But yeah, I think it's interesting because I think when people are asked this question, Alex, a lot of times they wouldn't mention the resource curse. They would talk about maybe the lack of productivity or different things. But I think it is like if we're to look at the root causes of different things, like why do we have productivity issues? Potentially, it is a little bit of the resource curse. It's because every 10 years there's a commodity super cycle, and then we do really well, and then we don't really need to, and we don't have the same impetus to invest in productivity that perhaps some other countries. What do you
Yeah.
think about that?
So two things. Just backing up to the productivity challenges that have been very well publicized over particularly the last couple of years. I mean, I sometimes struggle to understand our productivity numbers, and I've had these discussions with our economists internally and many other people. I mean, from a company perspective, Canadian labor is good. Like we actually have a very good labor and very productive labor force. And in fact, when you juxtapose it with other countries, I don't think we're at a significant disadvantage from that perspective. So it really comes down to this, and maybe that's actually a hindrance, actually, as far as like investment in technologies and ensuring that there's a automation within the context of factories. So I do struggle at times to understand the root cause of our productivity curse. Curse, that's the wrong way of putting it. Productivity challenges. And sometimes I actually question the numbers. I mean, I think in the same study that recently came out, France was the most productive economy in the world, and I'm not sure that is necessarily true when you when you dig into the numbers. So it is a bit of a conundrum for me.
Yeah, I was recently talking with somebody who was in the civil service in Canada for a long time, and like 35 years.
Yeah,
And that's one thing he was saying too, is this challenge of like, how do we measure productivity? There's certain structural factors of the Canadian economy, including the more preponderance of like mid-market or SMEs compared to other contexts that impact our productivity kind of scores. The geographic like immenseness of Canada,
always an issue.
the and also even like like one thing that this person mentioned was just like in some other countries that will have like a large percentage of undocumented residents. Often, like the undocumented residents, like economic contributions aren't included in that country's like labor productivity. So it skews like even Canada, the U.S. Like it kind of
Excuse.
skews things a little bit because Canada, definitely historically has not had the same kind of level of undocumented residents as the United States. So it's an interesting, it is interesting. There's such a fixation on labor productivity, and often there's that kind of double clicking on is this the most accurate metric? That being said, I think when you look at things like business investment in Canada, which is significantly lags the U.S., maybe that's something to like double click a little bit on because I know at BMO, you folks are extremely active in supporting Canadian companies. There's to my knowledge, pretty strong data that shows over like the last 50 years, Canadian companies at all levels invest less in research and development, and invest less in capital, like per worker. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think to a certain degree, I wonder whether it's not a direct result of actually having a very strong workforce and a very productive workforce. I mean, just anecdotally, what I hear is that hiring people in Canada is a lot easier sometimes than it is in the US, and that the pool of people and the availability of good resources in Canada is actually quite high. And so that might actually add to less of an incentive to automate and invest in companies at earlier stages than what you would see in the US. And particularly when you think around, the impetus to invest is often to take some of the redundancy out of work. I mean, I don't think that's as high in Canada as it is in the US, would be my supposition. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's certainly where my mind goes when I think about some of the challenges. And then, as you noted, I mean, I think the ability to invest in smaller enterprises and to make capital intensive expenditures is far more difficult when you have smaller companies than the larger scale of companies that you tend to have in the US.
Do you think like another aspect of it is like the kind of cultural one that some Canadian companies are more risk averse, that they're not as willing to make like large kinds of investments, and even like beyond the SME side, some of the data shows that like large Canadian companies are
Yep.
often less willing to invest in R&D and large kind of capital projects. So do you think that there's like a cultural element of it in terms of risk aversion and business investment?
I think there definitely is a component of risk aversion in it. I mean, we do tend to be generally less risk averse or more risk averse than in the U.S. And I think that when you think about some of the successful companies that have been created in Canada, they've been sort of bootstrapped from the beginning, and that does tend to lead to a culture of not being as willing to make large capital investments. And if you look at like the auto parts industry and the success that was had by like Magna and by uh, um, Hasenfratz in Guelph. I mean, both of those companies were started out of the garage by new immigrants to Canada, and they grew to tremendous scale. But for a certain period of their life cycle, capital investment was probably not the biggest thing that they were interested in, nor was R&D as they gained scale. It was only in the later stages as they became truly world class companies that I think they started to overachieve in that area. Um, and a lot of Canadian companies are very focused on the bottom line and profitability, and sometimes making those decisions. Uh, they tend a bit more towards being conservative than not being conservative in that regard.
To that point, and about Linamar and Magna and some very successful Canadian companies, and I think that's it's important, I think, to sometimes contextualize the doom and gloom, which I feel like can sometimes always happen in Canada. Like happened, I was a child at the time, but I feel like in the '90s, from what I read about it, there was a lot of, particularly the early '90s, there was a lot of doom and gloom about Canada's economic prospects. That the IMF was going to downgrade us, and to be fair, like there was a need for fiscal changes at that point. But I was at this conference recently, and there was a representative from the government of Ireland speaking, and it was all about productivity in Canada. And that's one of the things he said is he said, yes, Canada has issues, but like he's like, when I look at the G8 or G7 countries, like Canada's probably positioned like somewhere in the middle of in the sense that like our economic prospects are probably actually better than like Germany
Oh,
and a lot of other developed economies.
and I think it's a great point, and alluding to my earlier comment around education. I mean, I do think that when we look forward to the future, like having that backstop of a strong, well-educated workforce is going to benefit us. There is a lot of change that's going to happen in the next decade, as there has been in the last decade. And when you think of some of the macro factors that we're going to be facing, be it global warming, be it resource constraints, be it economic migration, Canada is advantaged in many of those respects. And when we talk about where we need to go to and how we can make sure the companies grow, keeping in mind where we need to get to over the next decade should be instrumental to how we're formulating things now. And we have challenges. There's no doubt that we have challenges, but there's a lot of fundamental things that we have done right, and I think that's been a big part of our success in many, many different areas over the last decade.
Agreed. I think that in these conversations, it's important to strike that balance between self-criticism and striving to be better,
Yeah,
with a recognition that we're not all Canada's not all bad, and there's a lot of good things that go for Canada, and both those things can be true at the same time. And
absolutely.
yeah,
And I'm amazed at as a result of the job, I have a chance to interact with a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of different companies, and I am constantly amazed and constantly surprised at not only the quality of the companies, but also the depth of expertise in a variety of different fields and the ability of these companies to grow. It's not easy to grow a company, and we have a tremendous track record of having people succeed in areas where in many respects they probably shouldn't have. And yeah, I think a lot of that is dependent upon just the entrepreneur and their ability to sort of you know continually think of the positive while at the same time addressing the negative. I mean, that is one very important context of being an entrepreneur. You have to have that optimism to continue to drive forward in spite of all the hurdles that are in your way. And we have there are a lot of different people that have that optimism and have that vision that have led them to be successful.
this is somewhat of an oxymoron, but I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs are paranoid optimists.
Yeah, you have to be. I mean, you have to be a very thick-skinned person in order to be an entrepreneur, and you have to have a vision that allows you to sort of get back up and to keep trying no matter what the setbacks are, because there's going to be setbacks, there's going to be naysayers, there's going to be people who can't tell you, and being able to say, okay, that's fine, but let's keep forward is I think one of the defining characteristics being a successful entrepreneur.
I agree. Yeah, thick skin is very very important, and I think most leadership roles, but definitely in entrepreneurship. And I think the other point about really successful like Canadian headquartered companies, there's been some fields like people talked about the hollowing out of the Canadian mining industry, for instance, where we don't have as many large mining companies that we used to. But I found when I founded Venture for Canada 10 years ago, we kind of first started in the tech sector and still do a lot of work in the tech sector. It's been remarkable, like in the last decade, the amount of large Canadian headquartered tech companies that exist today versus 10 years ago.
Oh,
It's like that. I mean, Shopify has like a valuation of probably a market cap of over $100 billion. But beyond that, Constellation Software has like a market cap of like $60 billion. Most Canadians have never heard of that company, right? Lightspeed's had challenges, but still like a pretty big company in Quebec. And yeah, just I could list off a bunch of other ones, but I think that sometimes in this like doom and gloom, there's also we need to like celebrate the fact that we in some ways have more knowledge based like billion-dollar companies than we did like 10 or 20 years ago.
yeah, and it's not just the billion-dollar companies, right? It's the plethora of these small, exciting companies in fields that most people probably aren't even aware of, that are growing quickly, that are innovating, that are changing the way that we do things. I mean, I think of some of the companies that we run across in the med tech sector and the exciting things that they're doing. I mean, these companies are going to be transformational, not only globally but for Canada. And in their fields, they're not household names because they're very specific components that most people probably wouldn't even be aware of. That to me is the exciting part of the Canadian economy. These companies that are, it's one guy with an idea that formulates a company, expert in his field, and is able to build a company around it. I mean, interacting with these people and being able to see what they have to go through to be successful, it's exciting. It's great to be part of.
And to your point, like having a large base of middle market kind of companies can be a huge strength. In the same way that diversification financially for an individual can be strong. If you have an economy where you have a large number of companies, both small and then some larger ones, I think it's also good to have big ones. But you look at Germany and people talk about like its economic strength. I think it's a term in German, but it's like Mittelstand or something. But it's this large number of German mid-sized companies
Yeah.
that are manufacturers, or in the Italian context, Italy's economy is very reliant on mid-sized firms, whether that's like luxury shoemakers, or there's all these firms that employ like a couple hundred people, really profitable, and do really well. And I agree, we need to celebrate not just the Shopify's of the world, but what are the 10,000 mid-sized firms that employ 300 people each and make like $10 million a year?
Yeah, and quite frankly, given the pace of change that we've seen and the pace of change that we're expecting within the economy more broadly over the next decade, having a broad base of middle market companies which can grow to be bigger companies, I think will, help diversify away from some of the risk of having just a couple of very, very large companies as we move forward. And the pace of innovation, the pace of the ability to adapt, I think is much greater for smaller companies that are able to pivot quicker as things develop. And, we don't compete in our backyard anymore. We compete globally. There is a company in you name it that is probably doing the same thing as some of the best companies that we have in Canada. But we still need to be ahead of the game. We still need to have good people. We still need to be able to change as quickly as possible. And we see that.
Yeah. To the point though about billion-dollar companies, and one of the things we talked about when we first connected was this question of like, how do we build an ecosystem in Canada that nurtures more companies to get to that like large global stage of like over $1 billion in annual revenue? So Alex, what advice do you have on how do we build this kind of ecosystem that nurtures these companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I do think that it's what's the old saying? It takes a village to create a billion-dollar company, and I think that's not the exact saying, but it does take a village or an ecosystem that allows these companies to develop. I think if you go back to sort of 2009 and you look at the venture space, the advent of the Vicky funds that was government backed allowed for the creation of a venture capital space within Canada that had struggled up to then as a result of not only the recession but also some of the dot-com issues that we had earlier in the space. Government support provided for all these private venture capital funds to sort of emerge, institutional investors to gain comfort with them because of the backstop that the government was having, and it created a base that has continued to grow and to continue to support Canadian companies at the seed and the earlier stage. We benefit from having a very stable banking industry. Quite frankly, I think access to banking in Canada is high, and the stability of the banking system, I think, is also a great economic. This isn't supposed to be a plug for us, by the way, but I actually do think it's a tremendous benefit to our economy generally as we look at supporting commercial companies growing. Where I think we have issues and where we've seen issues is in that when companies go beyond the medium size. Companies generally within Canada, I think, are challenged to scale, and they can scale to a certain extent. They can scale within the Canadian construct. They can scale within the Canadian venture capital private equity firm, but I do think they run into a ceiling at a certain point in time. We had the great fortune to be invested in a robotics company just recently that just transacted. And they found this. They could grow within that context. They could have Canadian investment up to a certain size, but then they became constrained. And so how do we remove that barrier? How do we make sure that companies in the context of Canadian capital can continue to grow beyond the medium and into the larger size? And I think all of us, that's a broad statement, both on the banking side, on the government side, and even on the investor side, have a place to play to make sure that we're addressing some of those bottlenecks within the system to enable Canadian companies to grow and scale and stay in Canada. Our private equity, we have a great ecosystem of private equity, but it isn't 1/10 of the American, it's probably 1/100th. And so the scale of what we can bring to bear in private equity, both the size of the funds and also the reach of the funds, I think still pales in comparison. And we need to have that. We need to have Canadian venture capital companies that can support companies, private equity companies. And so that over the life cycle of firms, as they continue to grow and to progress, they can, if they choose to, have their own path to be able to succeed into the future. And it's not easy. And I still think there's a lot of work to be done.
On the topic of private equity, I feel like probably since around when like Mitt Romney ran for president like 10 years ago, it became like a more divisive term. Maybe it was even beforehand, but it was more like leveraged buyouts and things like the 1980s. But the term private equity, I would say, became more controversial in the last like 10 years, where there's a sometimes image of private equity as people buying companies, cutting us all the expenses, or a lot of Canadians think of like Tim Hortons, and people love Tim Hortons, but at times its product has had some ups and downs in the last couple of years. Now that's not to say it's a blame on private equity, but it's to say there's sometimes this perception that or this question of does private equity. I would say people know private equity definitely has a track record of really strong risk-adjusted returns for investors. But then there's this question of does private equity result in a stronger national or kind of like regional economy? So I guess, Alex, in what ways do you think that private equity can like strengthen an economy? And I'm asking this because it seemed like in your response there was that argument for there to be more private equity in Canada. So I guess what do you view are some of the benefits of private equity?
Okay, it's a great question. Private equity has been around for 70 years, 80 years. It's not by any stretch of the imagination a new thing. The prevalence of private equity, I think, has increased dramatically over the last decade. We have a very strong cadre of private equity firms within Canada, and I do believe that they have a distinct place to play within the ecosystem of making Canadian companies grow. They can provide capital for growth. They can provide advice for companies as far as mergers and acquisitions. They can layer on professionalism. They can layer on, they can augment CEO teams. They can augment management teams to make sure that these companies, as they continue to grow, can focus on fundamentally what are their key differentiators, what are the reasons, that things that they need to do in order to be able to succeed. But like with anything, when you bring in an external view, it actually provides a good basis for people to understand the barriers that might be there for the success. And by having a broad base of exposure to a variety of different companies that are going through similar changes and challenges, I think private equity can augment management teams in a tremendous fashion. Having capital and augmenting capital so that they can invest in R&D, so they can invest in technology, so they can invest in sales, is something else that they bring to the table. The financial engineering, which many of them do, I think is table stakes. And, I don't view that as a key differentiator of private equity and what they can really bring to the table. And the other thing that I, keep coming back to is, if you look at the public markets, there are a lot of orphaned companies in the public markets that haven't been able to attract the coverage that they need, that haven't been able to differentiate themselves, and they're saddled with a huge administrative cost as a result of that. Private equity can help defray that and grow companies to a size and a scale where they can actually not end up in that sort of public hell, for lack of a better word, where they're just, they're orphaned, they have the huge administrative costs of being a public company, but there's no real benefit associated with it. And as we look at companies transition, we've had a tremendous track record of seeing private equity companies take firms and really transition them, really take them to the next scale, really build the success factors that they need in order to continue to grow. And sometimes that includes, taking companies from being entrepreneurial driven to professionalizing management. And that's a hard transition for anybody to make. But private equity can actually bring the sort of perspective that you need sometimes in order for those companies to continue to succeed as they go through the life cycle.
One area of the market that I feel like a lot of Canadians aren't as aware of is growth equity. And in this context of private equity, for listeners, there's some entrepreneurs that I met who have created very successful companies. Sometimes these businesses have been around for 20 years, and let's say the business has $50 or $60 million in revenue, but then they're like, "Hey, we really need to grow, but we want to grow really fast, and the way that we're going to do that is we need to raise capital." So they raise growth capital. They still usually often maintain majority ownership of the company or a significant ownership of the company. So I guess to your point about what role do you think that growth equity plays in creating this ecosystem of billion-dollar companies?
Yeah, I mean, having the ability to go out and acquire companies, to augment companies, not only through different geographic reaches, but also through technology or other purchases. I mean, growth capital is a fundamental part of that component. And the growth capital companies can provide that and enable people to go down that path. Minority equity versus majority, it's an interesting debate, but at the end of the day, sometimes minority equity looks more like control equity. Sometimes it really is minority equity, and everything comes with both pros and cons. When you're an entrepreneur, understanding the difference between what people bring to the table is key to determining how well you're going to interact with them in the future. And it's not easy. I mean, everybody comes with a very good story, but understanding their track record and being able to talk to other entrepreneurs that have worked with these firms and how they've helped them grow should be a key part of your diligence before getting anyone involved in any sort of acquisition, and often is. We've there's a lot of different types of private equity and growth equity out there, and sometimes it's not easy to distinguish between them.
Yeah, I'm thinking of instance. I have a good friend who lives in the United States who has worked at this company for 10 years. He's kind of in just below the executive team. And that company got growth equity, majority growth equity. And then around 3 months ago, the CEO and the founder who had founded the company 15 years ago, he got fired. The entire leadership team got fired.
Oh yeah.
And then my friend's like the last person standing because he's just below the leadership team. So all to say is that it can be complicated. And to your point, right? When you give up control, I think that it's something I've heard I've heard entrepreneurs kind of talk about this. Is that just to really understand, like when you give up control, like you're giving up control. Like
Oh yeah.
anything can happen. And I think that certainly in this case, my friend, he was just saying like I think they gave up control, but they didn't realize that the founders didn't really realize 100% what that like meant. When you're giving up control, it means you're actually giving it up. Um, but yeah, on the topic of kind of private equity and banking and the role that you folks play as like a major I think arguably like the leading or one of the leading commercial banks in not just Canada but like North America. Can you provide a little bit more context about your group within BMO, Alex? Like, what do you folks do? How are ways that you support entrepreneurs and kind of grow the Canadian business ecosystem?
Sure. So BMO Capital Partners is a evergreen fund within the commercial bank within BMO. We're about $1.5 billion in committed capital from the bank, and we really deploy it into three different sectors. So we do everything throughout the spectrum. I mean, so we'll do sub debt, which is primarily in the context of acquisitions or growth capital for a variety of different reasons. We do some pref equity. We do direct investments in companies. We do co-investments with both venture capital and with private equity. And then we also do fund investments in the broad spectrum of venture capital, private equity, and increasingly within sort of transition carbon focused, environmentally focused funds as well. And we get to, I'm lucky. It's a tremendous job that I have because we get to interact with companies throughout the spectrum. So we get involved at both early stages through VC funds and also direct investing with entrepreneurs. And we take it throughout that to multi-billion-dollar companies. And being able to participate in those many different segments gives you a perspective and an understanding of how complicated business really can be to grow and to scale. And then we also interact a lot with firms that are focused on either companies like Sage Capital that are involved with search funds. I mean, we're able to look at that as well, and so we've had a tremendous success in that regard as well. And being part of that ecosystem and being able to participate in that ecosystem, I mean, I feel incredibly lucky because, quite frankly, it does feel like when you're doing something for the benefit not only of the bank but also of the companies and the customers and everything else, and that you're really helping make differentiating companies and their ability to grow within the Canadian ecosphere. Not sure if that fully answered your question or not, but
No, that was great. And as we were chatting about before we started recording, is that I think BMO plays such an important role in Canada in providing the access to debt financing, equity financing as it relates to entrepreneurship through acquisition. And how do we get more people buying businesses in Canada? So many different ETA entrepreneurs that I've met have talked about how BMO is so active in this space. And I think it's something that is really needed because there's a need for without access to capital or in particular debt capital, it is virtually impossible for so many people to buy businesses in this country. And I think it's really important the work that you folks are doing. One thing, the kind of a BMO specific question that popped into my head is BMO now has like a significant like operations like in the United States. Like I'd be interested with post kind of your recent acquisition, like what percent of your revenue mix is for Canada versus kind of US. But imagine the US is probably like a pretty like potentially. I mean, you can give more details. I'm not sure if it's in the quarterly financial statements, but it probably maybe close to the size of Canada.
It is. Yeah, it's almost 50-50 now from a commercial bank perspective.
Yeah. How does having such like a large American like footprint and that significant exposure to American entrepreneurs and kind of the American commercial banking market, which the TD probably maybe has a little bit, although I think TD is more active in personal kind of banking. But yeah, that seems to me a sort of a defining thing about BMO, perhaps compared to some of the other banks, is you have such a large commercial banking footprint in the United States, like as a relative share of your total kind of banking operation. So anyway, how does having that significant exposure to the American market influence, if at all, the kind of way that you operate within Canada?
I mean, it does, right? I mean, there's tremendous benefits being having visibility both sides of the border and being able to sort of take best practices and approach and sort of learn from what's being done on either side of the border. The markets are different. I mean, there is a distinct difference between the Canadian bank market and the U.S. bank market, and a lot of it's structural, regulatory, et cetera, et cetera. But being able to take some of the fundamental drivers and understand what those differences are and where they are different, and make sure that our business is not only understands it but is also doing things for the right reasons, I think is a tremendous benefit. And when we look at the crossover between the Canadian and the U.S. economies and commercial businesses generally, there is tremendous crossover. I mean, you think about ag. Ag, in and of itself, is a North American business to a certain extent, right? The flow of agricultural products, agricultural inputs across the border is huge. And so having visibility both sides of the border, I think, is tremendously beneficial to us as an institution and also to our customers, because we're able to take things that we do in the US and migrate them to Canada, things we do well in Canada, migrate them to the US, and also to have visibility into where we're doing things differently and to make sure that we understand why we're doing things differently and whether we should be. From an institutional perspective, I think that's tremendous benefit to us and to our customers as we go down the road. And we've always had, from a BMO CP perspective, we've always had some exposure to U.S. companies. We've had direct equity exposure into U.S. companies, primarily via co-investments with Canadian private equity. But we're looking to expand that. We're looking to take what we've done incredibly successfully in Canada and to see how and when or where we can replicate it within the U.S. And I think having, feet on the ground and understanding of local business conditions and everything else will be a tremendous benefit as we look to roll out and to expand our presence into the U.S. and what we do in Canada into the U.S., quite frankly.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. I'm not a corporate strategist, but I can see the having that exposure to the American market, to your point, makes Canada stronger. But also, just like the U.S. is the most dynamic economy in the world, and having a large commercial banking presence there is I think a probably good bet to have. It's also, in general, with most things in the U.S., a fiercely competitive market.
Hugely.
And I guess, like on that point, Alex, like what, how does that like fierce competition in banking, or just in general, like in the United States, like impact the way that you kind of deliver kind of commercial banking within the American kind of context?
I'm probably not the best person to ask this question to, but what I will say is that you always need to be cognizant of what has been formative to your success. And I mean, BMO has been successful as a result of our Canadian expertise, and that has enabled us to expand into the US. And what we need to do is take what we're doing well here and learn from the experiences of the people that we've acquired in the US, and to learn the differences and why they're doing things in the US. I think that as we talk about the fiercely competitive nature of Canadian banks, of U.S. banks, I mean, we are now one of the top 10 commercial banks within the U.S. And we have unbelievable people and unbelievable reach within that market that we just have never had before. And so being able to augment the experiences that we've had, and we've been present in the U.S. for hundreds of years, but a large commercial presence in the U.S. for 20 some plus years. And we've continued to scale that over time. And this is really, I mean, it's not revolutionary to what we've done. It's evolutionary as far as the expansion in our footprint and the expansion of our capability set in the U.S. border. We've been competing there for a long time. This means that we'll just be competing at a broader and a more formative level than we have been in the
past. Super interesting. And it also makes me think about this question of like billion-dollar Canadian companies and just global Canadian companies. And I think often we think of now you can be Magna or Shopify, but also to recognize like Canadian banks are some of our like leading like global companies in terms of Canadian headquartered institutions that have significant presence outside of the country, whether it's BMO or Scotiabank in Latin America, RBC Investment Banking, TD, large, American footprint. When I think that they were in the top 10 for, I think, personal banking in the US. Anyway, I share that more in the sense that I think it's important to think about like financial institutions and not beyond banks like Brookfield, right? Like
Oh, yeah.
Canada has a financial sector that in some ways I think we punch above our weight on a kind of global stage, and it's a huge like economic strength. When we were talking about economic strengths earlier, I think it's sometimes maybe perhaps one that a lot of Canadians don't necessarily like fully appreciate.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a tremendous economic advantage, and the stability of the banking sector in Canada shouldn't be underplayed. I mean, we have a handful of large banks. They've got incredible reach and they've got incredible capability sets. Obviously, I'm a little bit biased towards BMO, but I won't go down that path. But the reality is that when we look at our ability to support Canadian companies, having that stability and not having some of the gyrations that we've seen in other countries. I mean, look at the SVB crisis that recently happened, and the impact that had on so many companies in the U.S. on the tech side, as they had to quickly react to what was a sea change as far as their ability to access financing in the U.S. And we haven't had a bank failure in Canada for, well, certainly beyond my memory. And you look at the U.S. and I think they've had 600 since 2009. The instability that creates in the system, and I know it creates a stronger system, and they like to see the competition, but that is tremendously disruptive as well and has a huge cost. And I think that having a more stable and more focused banking sector benefits companies and benefits Canadians. I mean, one way or another, we all own bank stocks, whether it's directly or indirectly. We're all exposed, so
Yeah.
you need to be cognizant of that. And I think when we think about some of the changes that we're going to be facing over the next decade, particularly when it comes to climate change and the environment, having a strong banking sector that is North American focused and able to provide and support the changes that companies need to go to is going to be critical to our future success.
Yeah, it's so critical. And to your point, that stability piece is something that even in a lot of developed economies, they don't have the level of stability that we have here in Canada. And even huge economies, like you look at China and some of the recent economic challenges that they've been having,
Yeah.
is there are huge issues with the Chinese banking system and shadow banks and things that kind of remind me of a little bit of like the mortgage subprime crisis in the U.S. in 2008, 2009 that have created a huge drag on the Chinese economy. I was reading that it's projected that over like a 3 or 4 year period, that China's economy, there's a negative 3% drag on their economic growth annually because of issues with their financial services sector. And to your point about like this theme, which is how do we build more successful Canadian companies? I think it's important that access to capital is like front and center, and that includes venture capital, but also banks.
Yep, and government. I mean, government plays a tremendous role. I think when we talk about the Vicky funds, when we talk about what they've done with BDC, EDC, in supporting not only new fund generation but also companies as they look to expand and grow, is going to continue to be critical, and more so when we talk about carbon neutrality and the changes that have to happen in our economy and where that support is going to come from. I'm struck by this. One of my favorite subjects lately has been the adoption of EVs, and why Canada and North America generally is lagging so much versus countries like China or parts of Europe, or what is it, 10% adoption rate in Canada, 50% plus in China, and is that going to become a structural impediment to our growth in the future, that we're not adapting and commercializing it much as quickly as some of these other companies? I often think about the experience with solar panels, and how the U.S. was the single biggest investor in solar technology for decades, but it was Japan that, through the commercialization in like watches and calculators, that really were able to commercialize that technology and see success as a result of it. And at the end of the day, leapfrog the U.S. as a result of that, vast commercialization of this technology. And I worry that, are we on a path where, as a result of not quickly adapting towards the need to electrify, we're going to get further and further behind the eight ball? And I think the government is doing a lot of efforts, but I think there's still a lot to be done in that area.
How to create affordable, clean electricity for Canadians, to the point about how do we create a system where Canadian companies can thrive, especially recognizing so many manufacturers, like industrial companies, like the cost of electricity is like a huge thing. It's the reason why Quebec has historically been a really attractive place for a lot of people to like launch new factories, because clean, cheap, like one of the like cleanest electricity in North America, and same with Ontario. In the sense of maybe not quite as clean as Quebec, but still Ontario's electricity is by and large. But I think it's perhaps like it's another. The productivity issue now I think is front and center for a lot of Canadians, and people see it in terms of their quality of life. But the issues with our electrical grid system, and how we are at a huge risk of like rolling blackouts and things in the future, and to your point, like our lack of electrical capacity impacts like EV adoption and various other things, I think is like a huge like underlooked issue. And it goes back to your other point of like where the public sector, regulators, they like have a huge role in creating the environments where Canadian companies can be successful. Because if there's not affordable electricity, then that's really hard for certain companies to be able to grow here.
Yeah, and you think about the risk associated with becoming carbon neutral for the majority of companies. There's a risk associated with it, right? And the government has a role to play in making sure that people are well set up and can adopt to the changing environment that we're going to see, and we're already seeing, quite frankly. So they definitely have a key stake in making sure that Canada continues to produce and can produce billion-dollar companies.
Alex, this has been a wonderful conversation. Is there anything that you wanted to share that you haven't already on this topic of how do we create an ecosystem to build more billion-dollar Canadian firms?
I think the one thing I would like to say is that, just one of my earlier points, there is a plethora of great Canadian companies and great Canadian entrepreneurs out there. And, I myself think that the environment around the culture around entrepreneurship within Canada has grown dramatically over the past 10, 15 years. And I constantly take a great deal of comfort in meeting young entrepreneurs and just their ability to go beyond just wanting to be doctors and lawyers, to want to grow companies, to want to found companies, to want to be part of that success. And I think, just to close on a very positive note, we have a lot of great strengths within Canada. And I think the entrepreneurial set that we have in the younger generation is tremendous and will position us well for success in the future.
Agreed. The future can be bright for Canada. There's so many strengths that we have as a country. Also some things for us to work on. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.